Hey guys, Mystery here, and this is a melee tier list for every melee in Darktide, circa 2025, mid-2025, just post the Arbides launch. So there's a few Arbides exclusive weapons included in here, as well as we have just received the balance patch that has updated about 7 of these weapon families, and we are still pre any changes to the dueling sword. So if you're watching this from the far-flung future and you know what has happened to the dueling sword, make sure you comment down below and let us know what ultimately became of one of the most dominant weapons at the current era. And before I begin, I just want to make a few disclaimers. Obviously, I attempted this on stream. Some of you might have caught that. I am attempting to redo it here because, man, on stream, my ADHD was wild and I couldn't finish a sentence and string a thought together to save my life. So I would rather re-edit this and redo it fresh and serve it to you hot than try to stitch it back together and serve it to you cold and disjoint it. And I also am incorporating a lot of knowledge that was shared with me through players and viewers who definitely know what they're talking about. Of note in particular, I want to shout out Ballhole, who was very supportive and let me know a lot about weapons that he's very familiar with. He's a very, very skilled player. Here's his channel. You should check him out. He is, as I said before, crazy skilled, and he knows a lot about off-meta weapons. So I leaned on him throughout the recording of the live chat to sort of guide me, because I am a meta slave and I know what's really good in this game. So if that's what you're interested in, I can tell you what the things that are overtuned and you can abuse are. But when it gets to that middle area, things get a bit hazy, and that's where there is some flexibility in terms of these rankings. But with that being said, let's go over the rankings. As you see at the very bottom here, we have the auric viability line. Now, what I'm saying by that, that's a cheeky way of saying everything here is viable on auric. If you're a player who is not getting into havocs and you're sticking to auric missions, or especially anything below auric missions, it simply does not matter what you bring to the game. You're going to have more success and you're going to win a more dominant victory when you're using a meta or above meta weapon. But if you don't, it's just fine. Your personal skill can easily carry in these difficulties simply because there's just not enough armor or bosses to go around to really threaten you and make you need to pick up a better weapon. The weapons that go above this havoc viability line that you can see here into the best off meta and meta categories, these weapons generally have very low time to kill. Some of them have area of effect, and the armor penetration values are very high. Those are the categories that generally define this group of weapons. So when I'm putting stuff down here, especially in the standard fare category, it's not that these weapons are absurdly weak. It's that they just are lacking something that makes them viable into the in-game mode Havoc, where there's a ton of armored enemies. And if you just get overwhelmed by crushers, there's nothing you're going to be able to do. So let's start here down way at the bottom with needs rework. This is only going to apply to a select handful of weapons. Most of these weapons are in some sort of shape where their numbers could be tweaked and they could be brought up to where they need to be at, but there are a select couple weapons that are just in such poor condition that they've been buffed a couple of times, time and time again, or maybe they even haven't been looked at in case of one of them, and they are just so jank. They are so unpleasant to play with. They don't offer anything when you are playing with them because their power is also low comparatively. So that's what needs rework means, is that these just need to be kind of overhauled entirely, or something very radical needs to be done to make them viable in any way. Then we have too weak. This is another kind of small category, but these are weapons that I'll mention it several times within the video, I'm certain, but these are weapons that I would consider are stuck in the 1.0 version of Darktide, when the pacing of the game was slower, when there was far less enemies on screen, when the time to kill could be much higher. But now that things are much more condensed and hectic, you are demanded to have high mobility, to have low time to kill, to have other additional weapon blessings or effects. And these weapons just aren't exactly where the meta is at, because either they're lacking damage, they're lacking stagger, they're lacking time to kill, whatever it is. They're lacking something, and perhaps just an increase in numbers could bring them up. Then we've got standard fare. These are weapons that I don't have any problem with, right? These are weapons that are probably balanced for Darktide. They're definitely balanced and very viable into auric games, but once you take them into Havoc, they generally are lacking armor penetration, and without some sort of ability or way to penetrate armor or increase their damage significantly, they're going to fall underneath that curve, and they're just going to make you struggle really, really hard to do what you need to do. And thankfully, there's a lot of weapons that are going to be in these top two categories. So here we're passing this Havoc viability line. All the weapons up here, if you are interested in progressing in this game and getting better and pushing your skills, especially pushing and trying to get Havoc 40, you can play with any weapons in these top two tiers here. The best off meta weapons aren't necessarily worse in a pound for pound thing than the meta weapons, but they require a more specialized skill set. So you can get similar results with these weapons as you can the meta weapons, but they are going to need you to put some extra effort into learning how to use these weapons and get the juice out of them. And then, of course, the meta weapons. These are weapons that are probably the paragon of what weapons want to be in Darktide. They're very powerful. They have good killing ability. They have special abilities or blessings that are very, very useful for the team, and they also offer high survivability to the player, because that's a very important factor for melee weapons, since you're usually using these when you're surrounded by enemies. So meta weapons are definitely the go-to. I would say that I'm very comfortable with the meta weapons, and I think that they are in a good spot for this game, but I cannot say the same about the who balanced this tier. This is again a select few weapons, but these weapons are overtuned for the game that they're in. They trivialize a lot of content, especially lower down. They have very, very easy, low or high skill floors, low skill ceilings. You can pretty much know everything you need to know about these weapons in like an hour or two, and they are very, very highly tuned. They do a ton of damage. They have very good blessings, and they just kind of make a lot of other weapons irrelevant. And so I'll mention it time and time again in this video, but if this tier is removed and they are instead moved down to meta tier, we would see a lot more diversity in builds. But these weapons, as they are so dominant that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're trying to play with the best thing to use anything but these weapons. So that is where we're currently at, and with that being said, let's get underway. What I'm going to first do is I'm going to place one weapon into each tier so I can give a good example of what these things might be. So when we're talking about the 2-week tier, I think obviously we should put Mr. E subbing in there. Subbing to Mr. E, clearly it's a little bit too weak. We don't even have 20,000 subscribers yet. So if you're watching this and that number still doesn't say 20 as the first two digits, perhaps you could help and make that happen, and you get more good content like this. But let's go ahead and put something into the who balanced this tier. I think everybody knows that this is going to happen at some point, so let's go ahead and grab the Macabian Mark IV Dueling Sword and drop it right up there. The Macabian Mark IV Dueling Sword has been the preeminent, most dominant weapon in the Zealot, Psyker, and Veteran class for over a year and a half now, and it has been the subject of a lot of hate posting by lots of the community, and I think the tide is turning, no pun intended, the tide is turning against it. I've been seeing a lot more negative sentiment about its existence lately, especially since the Arbides class has been added, and it's proven that weapons can be solid without being overpowered, but this weapon is definitely overpowered and overshadows a lot of options, especially because it is a cross-class option, and therefore makes a lot of the class uniques feel less valuable in comparison. This thing has absurdly strong single target damage on its heavy 1 and heavy 2, which are just repeated thrusts, and combined with a staggering special attack, you can instantly kill / stagger any enemy all the way up to crushers. It has Uncanny Strike, which allows you to penetrate armor instantly and instantly gut through those scary targets. And of course, it's one of the fastest moving weapons in the game and has decent horde clear potential as well. It's just a super safe, super high DPS and well-rounded weapon that has generally very little flair to the way that it's played with, other than the movement tech. And I will be glad to see it go whenever it does receive a nerf. Let's move on to the meta tier and put one up there. The meta tier, let's see, what's a good candidate for the meta tier? A solid candidate here would probably be something like our lovely sword or lovely slab shield for the Ogrin. This is just a solid weapon. It has good stagger. It has good synergy with the class because of the Blessing Skullbreaker on this thing that's going to augment all damage that goes into enemies, but it isn't completely overpowered. This weapon has slow attack speed, so you need to be charging up your attack ahead of time, and it does reasonably well, reasonably good damage against lots of targets. It's just a really, really solid all-rounder weapon, albeit a bit boring, but it synergizes very well with the batter talent on the Ogrin, since you can apply 4 stacks of bleed on your first heavy attack, and you can just rinse and repeat those heavy attacks over and over, hitting everything in front of you, applying stacks of bleeds, and keeping it staggered forever. You can also stagger a single target to the ground and then beat them with your light attacks to apply Skullbreaker instantly and get a ton of additional damage on them. Just a very well-rounded weapon that also has kind of a meme tier weapon special, being able to plant a shield and block bosses infinitely. Pretty cool, but definitely in the meta. In terms of best off-meta weapons, these are weapons that aren't quite on the same page, but I would say that the Mark 6 Power Sword probably fits this bill quite nicely. This weapon has lots of damage, very good horde clear, carves through metal, but you require the activated mode to do that. So there is an extra hurdle to jump over, and it does take a little bit of game knowledge and skill and spacing in order to activate the weapon and then pull off the attacks you need to pull off. So that's what sets it below the meta tier. Is the meta tier, a lot of these weapons are just unga bunga, face roll, like, you know, how can you really go wrong with the slab shield? Whereas the power sword, you can get the same results out of it if you are smart about it, but if you activate it at the wrong time, you can pay the price. Moving on down to the standard fair tier, we have to discuss weapons that are, you know, just fine. Like, they are perfectly well balanced for non-Havoc difficulties, and you know, it's really, really hard to balance around a game as insane as Havoc is. So these weapons are probably reasonably balanced for the vast majority of Darktide, but they tend to struggle against armor, and if you're locked in a room with like 5 crushers, there's really not any reasonable way you're going to be able to get through them without some specialized kit within the talent trees. So these weapons on their own, I would call them standard fare. Not to say that they're weak. You can absolutely top frag with any of these weapons when the map does not roll high armored targets, but a great example of this would be our friend the Devil's Claw Mark IV here. Really solid weapon. I like the swing pattern on this thing. It does have a lot more armor penetration potential than the Mark IV does, but obviously it's lacking far behind other options in the game, and you basically have to rely on hitting those riposte hits to actually get any real damage done. Although it is a very, very safe weapon because those block windows are so huge now. But I'm not saying, again, that this weapon is in any way, shape, or form weak. In fact, there's going to be lots of weapons that I put in the standard fair tier that are easily able to be used by high tier players and make them work in Havoc. But for the vast majority of players, like the 99% players, we are talking about weapons that just are not going to be fun or enjoyable to try and make work in Havoc at all. Moving on to the 2-week tier, I think the paragons of the 2-week tier are the Chainswords, both of them. These one-handed Chainswords are just stuck in Darktide 1.0, as I said when I was describing the weapon tier. These weapons just overcommit in terms of allocating too much of their power in their special ability. This is an era where Fatshark thought that weapons with special activated abilities needed to have lower base stats on their regular weapon attacks to compensate for the surely massive power that these weapon specials would give. Unfortunately, the weapon special on this thing, the little, chainsaw action, doesn't really do all that much damage. It has a very low DPS output. It takes 2 to 3 charges to rip through a crusher or a bulwark, and that is just not an impressive time to kill in the modern era of Darktide. There's weapons on this list that can exceed these weapons' DPS by just light attacking. So what's the purpose of using a weapon that uses a weapon special that doesn't do good boss DPS or any single target DPS at all? And when we talk about their regular weapon stats for their non-special weapon attacks, they have low impact, they have decent cleave, but low damage as well. So these weapons aren't particularly safe to play with in melee because though they are fast and have good cleave, they don't stagger enemies and they don't kill enemies very fast. So you're going to be working all day to kill enemies like crushers and maulers. And even if you use your weapon special, you're going to be locked into them and be open to enemy attacks while it's going on. So they're just kind of a disappointing weapon because they are definitely in the sort of the public eye a lot. These are very, very iconic weapons of the setting. So it's sad that they don't stack up to that expectation. For the needs rework tier, we have got our lovely Atlas Combat Axe. The Atlas is part of the Combat Axe weapon family, which includes the Antax right here and the Rashad down here. These weapons have excellent blessings, and the Rashad and it actually have a lot in common. They have the same stat typings. They have finesse as well as first target, which means they should do ostensibly very, very good single target damage. The Rashad does obscene boss damage and really good single target with a very simple overhead chop, chop, chop heavy attack pattern. And that's where the Atlas gets it wrong. The Atlas's moveset is so fundamentally broken that it is unusable. The heavy overheads, first of all, the first heavy attack isn't an overhead. You charge up this attack that's supposed to kill the, target out one enemy to be killed, which is the idea of a heavy attack generally, and it comes from the side. So you'll catch all sorts of crap before you manage to land it on the actual target you want. And it doesn't have any cleave, so it'll get stuck on trash rather than impact with a crusher or a mauler. Then the attacks outside of that are very wonky and come from all sorts of off angles that make it much more inconsistent to hit a target, to hit a head, than either the Rashad or the Antax, its brothers. These weapons have usually very absurdly easy swing patterns to hit heads with, and this weapon makes it an absolute chore. So what I'm saying about needs rework here is that the stats, the damage numbers are all there, but the way in which you need to play with this weapon to actually deal the damage is just so fundamentally annoying and broken that it just needs a rework. It needs to have a completely new swing pattern added to it, or it needs to have access to special blessings or special abilities the other weapons don't, because its weapon swing pattern is that far behind its brethren in the weapon family. And with that being said, let's go ahead and work our way back up. And we'll just rinse and repeat until I've used all the weapons I can possibly think of using. Well, until I've used all of them, especially. Another, and probably the only other weapon on the tree that needs a rework is the Power Maul, aka the Paw. The Power Maul has been buffed in 3 subsequent patches for Darktide and for the Ogrin, and none of those buffs have brought it anywhere near relevancy. In fact, it was completely ignored in the major weapon overhaul that came out with the Ogrin rework about 3 to 4 months ago, and that makes me think that there must be a full rework coming forward at some point. They have to realize that these small middling buffs they've been giving to it are amounting to diddly shit and actually aren't fixing the base problems with this weapon. My biggest issues with this weapon are the activatable ability has very little impact and is almost never really used to any effect, and activating this weapon for whatever reason causes the Ogrin, a 1500 pound gorilla monster, to have to slow down to a crawl for a second, which makes no goddamn sense. This weapon also has terrible base damages. It is far behind any of the clubs that are on the class, which makes no sense because it is a club. It's suffering from that syndrome where Fat Shark gives a weapon an activatable ability and therefore they nerf its base stats by like 20%. So yeah, it's not got a good activatable ability. It's really hard and clunky to use, and it has a terrible time to kill. The only thing it's good for is staggering enemies, and I think the Ogrin's doing all right at that on his own. Speaking of Ogrin, let's go ahead and get rid of these clubs that are up here. What do you say? First off, we have the Mark 1 Bully Club. This weapon, I would say, is probably just a meta weapon, right? This weapon is very, very solid. Its heavy attacks come down as overheads and do tons of damage. They're very, very simple. Just bonk, bonk, bonk. It does good damage into crushers and carapace. It does good damage into everything. Although it did just receive kind of a heavy nerf. Actually, I'm going to move it down to best off meta, honestly. It received kind of a heavy nerf to its heavy 2, because up until recently, the heavy 2 was doing triple damage to unyielding, which includes bosses, reapers, and bulwarks. And that was subtly making it a lot, well, not so subtly, but making it a lot better than it ends up being. But it is still a very, very solid weapon, and it's definitely Havoc viable because of its ability to punch through armor, has no problem with it. And of course, this weapon has Skull Crusher and Thunderous, two of the best possible blessings that any weapons could have in the current meta of Darktide. So those weapons are going to be prioritized above all else if they can access, especially the Skull Crusher blessing. So I'll rank it as best off meta because I just don't think it's right there in the same zone as the shield is anymore, especially considering you can get better results by heavy attack repeating with the shield than you can with this single-handed mace. But we have to talk about the Mark III Bully Club. The Mark III Bully Club is definitely in the Who Balance list here. This weapon makes all other weapons on the Ogrin semi-irrelevant, excepting maybe some of the pickaxes, because this weapon has access to both Thunderous and Skull Crusher, which means he can trivialize enemies that are armored and trivialize any enemies that can be staggered. And of course, this is Ogrin we're talking about, so stagger is sort of the name of the game for him. This has a brain dead, an absolutely brain dead weapon swing pattern. Left, right, left, overhead, left, or right, or whatever it is. Like just swing, 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 left, right, clear all the hordes, and then every so often a smashing, fucking life-destroying overhead comes out. This thing hits crushers for like no joke half of their health bar. So all you have to do is soften them up by hitting them a couple times with your light attacks, and then this overhead comes out and just dunks them to the next dimension. So it's both a horde clear like non-stop monstrosity weapon, and then it just dunks on heavy single targets as well. You never need to use any heavy attacks on this weapon. All you need to do is hold down light spam. Whenever I play with this weapon, I have a mouse bind that just spams light attack repeatedly, and it works perfectly fine. This weapon has absurd boss DPS, and of course it has an insanely fast swing speed, so which means it stacks the bleed stacks from the Ogrin's talent batter even faster, and it's just all around sort of a problem because it completely skews the power distribution in its favor. It makes weapons that are ostensibly otherwise obscenely good, like the slab shield, look like a joke in terms of damage throughput and usefulness. Now, there are other weapons on the Ogrin class that can compete in terms of raw damage, but for the blessings, when you're considering those blessings as well, like Skull Crusher, this weapon cannot be beat. It's an all-rounder. You can put it into any Ogrin build, and it will perform top of the line. So that is what I have to say about that thing. But by comparison, its brethren in the Mark II club is just too weak. This thing has way worse stats than either of its two competitors do, and its swing pattern is really bad. So you'll have a terrible time to kill with this weapon, and you should be using one of the other options instead. I don't think I've ever actually caught an Ogrin using one of these in a live, real game, because you start the game with this one, and this one looks the coolest. So you would probably only either use this one or this one. This one looks like shit, and it is shit, so that's good at least. But yeah, it's mostly down to the fact that this thing has a worse swing pattern than the other two, and it suffers from worse damage. So it's not even like the Atlas like that. But what it needs is just some stat increases, I think. It can have that worse swing pattern, but it just needs to have comparable stats. We've got the Agni Shock Maul coming up here. This is a meta weapon. This weapon is obviously the most used on the Arbitrator class. This weapon has the ability to shock enemies and therefore makes usage of the high voltage blessing, but it also has Skull Crusher, which is a thing I'm going to mention time and time again. By the way, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, Skull Crusher is a blessing that when you hit an enemy who is staggered with it, they receive 40% extra damage while they remain staggered, or for the next 5 seconds, whichever one is shorter. And so for the Arbitrator especially, because he has an ability to force enemies into the stagger state with his concussive talent, this weapon absolutely rocks. It can multiply the damage that bosses take by an absurd amount just by bonking them in the head once or twice with this thing. It's a super fast weapon. It's super simple to use. The heavy attacks are just overhead smashes, so you're very likely to hit that headshot. And of course, its weapon special is a little taser prod that does kind of obscene damage to captain shields, which when you're considering Havoc and above, there's lots of these captains roaming around, and it's nice to be able to burn their shields down very quickly so they don't get any time to counterplay you. So just a nice solid meta weapon. I'm glad to see it get a couple of very small buffs and just generally excel on the arbitrator class, though it's far from being his absolute best weapon. We got to talk about some axes next, guys. Let's plow through a couple of these axes here. We've got the Antax here. I'm going to say the Antax is standard fare. The reason it doesn't cross that Havoc viability line for me is because this weapon struggles with armor a lot. I know this as a person who probably put 500 hours in playing with the Antax, because on the launch of the game, this was one of the best weapons in the entire game for Zealot characters. It was obscenely broken. The light attacks on this weapon are doing, hundreds of damage. They're very strong, and when you hit the heads, you're just going to lop things heads off. It has a very easy swing pattern, just left, right, diagonal, repeating, and therefore it's just a solid light attack monster. You'll notice that this weapon is strong. If you end up in a solo game and you've got bots who happen to roll with this weapon instead of the Devil's Claw, they will hold their own about 3 times better with this weapon versus the Devil's Claw, because its damage throughput is just that much better on just spamming light attacks like the bots do. So if you are a bot, grab the Antax and just chop away. This is my recommendation to a lot of newer players because it is just such a brain-dead simple weapon and produces great results, and it's available on all human classes except for the Arbitrator now. That being said, though, we got some tack axes up next. So the tack axes are all going above this Havoc viability line. They've recently received a very nice buff to their quality of life in terms of movement speed. They can now channel some of their attacks while they are sprinting, and they can therefore be used to give you movement tech and boost your speed even more in excess of normal speeds, which is going to put them into the meta tier. The weapons can do that, but also these weapons have always had really good time to kill, and the only downside they had is their short range was holding them back. But now that they are fast moving weapons, they can account for that a little bit better. Personally, I think that the Mark II is an off-meta choice. It's just not quite as optimal as the other two. I think most players would agree that the Mark VII here is just hands down the best of the options available. But the Mark IV is also in that meta tier for me, because the Mark IV has a very easy overhead 1 into overhead 2 combo, both of which just recently got a buff that are giving them more damage modifier versus Carapace, which is probably the one main enemy type that these weapons struggle any amount with at all. So these weapons are all very solid. You can't go wrong with any of them, and it really just comes down to your own personal flavor, though I think most players would agree that the Mark VII is just dominant in terms of DPS output. Down here, we've also got some pickaxes. Let's talk Ogrin pickaxes. We've got the Barovian pickaxe and the Brinks pickaxe up next. Well, the Brinks pickaxe is a very solid meta choice. The Brinks pickaxe has absurd single target DPS in bursts, right? So the thing that makes this weapon crazy is because you aren't constantly fighting with enemies. Generally, if you can make a little bit of space and charge up an attack, you can land an attack on any enemy in the game and kill them in one hit, excepting bosses. But even bosses, like, you really hurt them bad. Like, you let a captain's shields go down, and then everyone stands back for a second while the Ogrin sets up and holds this axe towering above his head, and then he drops the hammer, and it's pretty much a Ogrin thunder hammer is what it is. You really got to pick your shot and hit on the target, but when you do, it'll just dunk them instantly. So it becomes a very potent weapon for purple and red modifiers, where you need to be instantly killing enemies, and its overkill damage also allows it to be viable with enemy damage reductions like orange when we're talking Havoc considerations. Compare that with the Borovian pickaxe. I think the Borovian, honestly, I don't think it's standard fare. It does work, so I'll put it into the best off-meta category, although in my live ranking I did rank it lower, but obviously it has the damage numbers to compete. It's up here somewhere. I think it's at least as good as the Mark I Bully Club is, so I'll put it up here in the best off-meta. You can play with this weapon it just isn't as optimal as either of its two siblings. This is the weapon for heavy attack, landing, selective heavy attacks, and the Carcelis, which we'll catch a little bit later on, or I guess we can catch it now. Where is it? There it is. And the Carcelis, which is also meta, is for heavy attack, relentless spamming, and light attack spamming. Just being a brain dead Unga Bunga for the Carcelis here, and being a smart Unga Bunga who hits heavy attacks for the Branks. The Carcelis just isn't exactly good at either of those. It's not amazing at its throughput on single attacks, and it's not amazing at its fast swing speed. It just isn't. It's kind of like the worst of both worlds, right? It finds itself in this Goldilocks zone where these weapons really want to commit in one direction or the other in order to be the best they can possibly be. So it goes into that best off meta, although, you know, it's still definitely viable in Havoc thanks to its damage profiles. Oh boy, we got another weapon, and this will be the last weapon that is going to go into the who balance this tier. These three weapons right now are the kings of the various classes, and as you can see, there is one available on each class currently. Who knows what this will be, if anything, once the Dueling Sword is nerfed. But these two weapons are class exclusive, and they have a lot in common. This weapon, the Arbides Mark III Munitorum Shock Maul, I believe that's what it's called, is just this weapon. It is the brainless light attack spammer that just has far too much damage and statting on the weapon. It's far too fast in attack speed, and it's very, very hard to punish, right? There's the moveset is something you can learn in like minutes, not even hours or days. It has 250 base damage on, to compare it to this Shock Maul, right? Which is also a meta weapon with a very, very good Agni Shock Maul. Agni Shock Maul has a light attack of 150 and a heavy attack of like 240. This is a light attack of 250 and a heavy attack of 350. So there's some power creep going on there. Now you might say, oh, you know, it doesn't have Skull Crusher, so it must be worse, right? Well, but it also has access to Relentless Strikes, which stacks up to 50% strength when you're repeatedly attacking the same target, and which means it's going to capitalize when something is Skull Crusher staggered by someone else in your team, and it has access to high voltage, which is going to increase your damage it also in excess. This weapon has stupid stagger, has just stupid power. It's really easy to learn, and it's hard to put down once you pick it up because it is just so powerful. It in itself is a big portion of why a lot of Arbides players probably feel the class is like overtuned, is because this is the weapon you start with, and it's just like, oh, okay. Well, not that any of the Arbides weapons are really all that bad. The class probably is overtuned, but yeah, this is not doing them any favors in terms of the balancing argument. So yeah, this weapon is completely busted. Try it out while you still can. Who knows? Meta weapons. Gonna throw the Arbides other melee weapons up here while we're at it. I love these things. The Mark 9 or 11, probably 11, and Mark 6. These are the Arbides Shock Maul plus Suppression Shield combos, and they are awesome. The Mark 11 has lower damages, but generally I think like a more sophisticated moveset that can be used better by like high skill players. But to me, there's nothing as simple pleasure as the Mark 6 and its Unga Bunga playstyle. You can honestly just spam light attacks and just win game with these. They really showcase what I feel like they could have done with the slab shield for the Ogrin. The Ogrin is so slow and methodical, and these weapons are exceedingly fast. They are very, very fast, and they come out in a lot of force with a lot of stagger. And of course, they've got that really awesome weapon special that can flashbang everything in front of you. Fun fact that flashbang actually counts as staggering enemies. So if you have any effects that trigger on stagger, that counts. So including the Keystone Forceful, that will stack up instantly based on how many enemies you flashbang with it. And it's just such a great weapon, a great utility weapon. Being able to block range attacks with it, including snipers, is always awesome. And I love playing it with the perfect block. I forget what it's called, but the perfect block blessing that gives you 25% strength and shocks the enemy that attacks you when you perfectly block, just allowing you to overhead block crushers and retaliate with just some severe force. It's very, very fun, and I love it. So definitely going in the meta tier for sure. All right, let's talk about some shovels, shall we? We have two varieties of shovels to talk about here. We've got both the Ogrin shovels and the Veterans shovels. Both of them are pretty good, although they don't really have anything super special to write home about. The Ogrin shovels, though, are going to take the cake here. These things, honestly, at least two of the marks, are very, very solid. This is the mark... What's this called? This is the Mark 3 latrine shovel. This shovel, I would say, falls into the standard fare bracket. Obviously, it's an Ogrin. Obviously, it's a shovel. It has thrust, all that stuff. So it does fine, but it doesn't capitalize on what the other two shovels capitalize on because it doesn't have the weapon special strike down thing, which the Ogrin can use to absurd effect. The other two marks have that flipping the blade down and then striking with the blade, which for an Ogrin, fully charging thrust can almost kill a crusher. I bet if you had a couple extra buffs on your bar, you could actually dunk on a crusher instantly. The Mark 5 latrine shovel, which is the sort of more gold one here, it invests more of its power into that strike down. Its regular attacks are a little bit weaker by comparison, whereas the Mark 19 is a very well-rounded shovel. It's got very powerful heavy attacks, left right sort of diagonal sweeps that do have a decent amount of armor penetration, and then the flip blade special is nearly as powerful. So I think they're both in definitely an off meta tier. If an Ogre knows what they're doing with the shovels, they're going to be just fine. For the Munitorum, or whatever these are called, the veteran shovels, I think I'm gonna have to rate them a little bit lower. The only one that I really felt like I could get a whole lot out of was the Mark 1, but I would say that I think I'm going to be remiss if I put these up into the Havoc, above the Havoc viability line. They just really lack that armor penetration. I'm certain that skilled players can get a lot out of them, especially the Mark 1, because it has a thrust on the weapon special that's sort of like the Dueling Sword thrust that pretty much guarantees a stagger, has very, very high stagger values. But I think that this one, at the very least, or at the very most, is going to be pushing that standard fair line, because it's just a pain to kill anything that has armor at all. And they do have access to some pretty decent blessings. Both of these weapons, both the Ogrin versions and this version, have access to these blessings. So once you stacked up, this one actually has, does it have Skull Crusher? It has Skull Crusher, I believe. Yes, and it has Uncanny Strike, and it has Thrust. So it's like the Dueling Sword of of shovels. But yeah, even with Uncanny Strike, I think you're pushing it if you're trying to take it into Havoc, and so I think I'd be remiss to put it up there and tell veterans to use it up there. I think the veterans would be better served in the current meta of things using something like a Tac-Axe or a dagger, or the Dueling Sword while you still got it. Those are weapons that I think are superior. These weapons, you can have fun with them, you can do well with them, they've got good blessings, but I just don't think the base damage is probably quite there yet to be able to take on Havoc. And let me see if I can remember which one I really didn't like out of this set of shovels. We have the Mark 3 and the Mark 7. I want to say, I don't know, somewhere here. Let's put them in 2 week. I just think that's probably the thing for shovels. Only a small buff, and they would be a lot more viable, like 20% or something like that. And I honestly would have a lot less problem with them. Speaking of things that needs a buff and is 2 week, the Mark 3 Bull Butcher Cleaver for the Ogrin is in sort of a wonky bad spot. So this weapon sacrifices a lot on its light attacks to make its heavy attacks more powerful, and its heavy attacks are very, very slow over the top swings. And that means that when you are doing anything but heavy attacking, you are barely have any killing capability at all. It's ridiculous to me that a weapon that's on the Ogrin has I think it has sub 100 damage on its light attacks, which is absurd, and it's not even that fast. Nor does it have very much stagger, and the weapon special is just a punch, like all the cleavers are, but it doesn't really capitalize on that punch because it can't get too much done in the interim while the enemy is staggered, thanks to the fact that you have to charge up those heavy attacks. So this weapon definitely needs a buff to bring its stats in line with the other bull butcher, or the bull cleavers. I'm going to give the Mark 6 one the standard fare rating here. It's almost there. It's got the stagger punch. It can, it can chop some pretty hefty chops on those sweeps, on those heavy attacks, and its light attacks aren't a bad pattern. But it just doesn't have that high a DPS when all things are considered, and there's better options on the Ogrin class, like a good number, as you can see. And then, of course, they're competing with the Mark IV, which I would consider a best off meta pick. This thing has a punch, which you can then follow with 2 quick stabs. And one of the things that's really effective on this weapon is you can get the blessing that gives you extra strength after you've done a weapon special for, I think, 3 seconds. And then you can follow up that weapon special punch with a couple of stabs and then rinse and repeat. And just stagger these enemies forever, really. It's kind of fun. So that's it for those cleavers. Let's talk the Catachan swords. I might be getting myself in a little bit of trouble here by saying this, but I don't think that the Catachan swords are really Havoc viability ready. They require a great deal of personal skill and a different sort of approach to a playstyle to get the maximal benefit out of them, especially when we're looking at the Mark 1, which is the one with the teeth here. This one is definitely too weak. The reasoning that this weapon one is so weak is because it doesn't have any armor penetrating moves. Its heavy attacks and light attacks are just left-right sweeps. It's a great beginner weapon when you're only just taking on like hordes and stuff. But outside of that, you're going to really suffer when you encounter your first crusher with this weapon. And the retaliatory attack isn't very good either. I think I feel the same way about the 7. These weapons can be used in Havoc, right? I've seen people do it, but you got to question, what is the skill level of the player on average who's bringing these things into Havoc? And wouldn't they do better with a lot of other options? And the answer for me is yes, because in order to get, like I said before, in order to get the full power out of these weapons, you have to be using the parry special move, which means altering your playstyle to something that is probably uncomfortable for most players, and they just don't have very much juice in the main strike patterns that they have. Now, they do have pretty solid blessings on them, so that can compensate for a lot of that lacking power. They include Skull Crusher in there. Skull Crusher can be really good because you have pretty much a guaranteed stagger if you do land a riposte attack. But I think that is like really begging them to be a little more powerful than they present themselves to the vast majority of players. And I want this to be a tier list for most people to look at, and not just my like top 5% of all players in the game. Now we have some daggers to talk about. The daggers are definitely what we would consider meta weapons. These are weapons that were top of the line before the Dueling Sword took their crown. Reason being, they are very fast, mobility-wise weapons. They do lots and lots of crits. They have good synergy with crits through their bleed talents, and they have Uncanny Strike on there, so they ignore armor, which they can stack up very quickly. And of course, they have fast attack speeds, which is always just kind of king in Darktide. Fast attack speeds make you safer by either killing enemies faster or leaving less room for enemies to attack you. So these weapons will probably return to being near the top of the meta once the Dueling Sword has been taken down a rung or two. They've always been fairly solid, but I would say that, you've got a good choice between these weapons here, and they're still very viable, especially if you are looking to apply bleeds, which are great at bosses and unyielding types. So we've got the Mark III here, which is for more a speedy assassin playstyle, coming in with those heavy ones that are overhead stabs to the neck, And then Mark 6 is got exchange that heavy 1 for sort of cocking your fist back and slashing horizontally, which can be better for horde clear. And don't worry, you still have single target on this thing because your push stab pushes out a poke that comes out absurdly fast and does some really serious damage. I think I started out liking the Mark 3 better, but ended up liking the Mark 6 at the end of the day. Speaking of weapons I do like, it's the Force Swords, the Force Great Swords. These weapons came out with the Havoc update. They came out at the same time the Relic Blade did, and they are excellent melee Psyker, or just really generally any Psyker weapons. They've got good swing patterns, solid damage, solid cleave, very easy to clean up hordes with them. And of course, you've got the wind slash, big ultimate slash thing out. A thing that people overlook is that these weapons do have very considerably high boss damage, but it takes a little bit of setup for the Mark. I think it's 7. I can't remember the marks now, but the Mark 7 has a push stab that comes out if you hold a heavy after you push. Both these weapons have the little force shield push that can push away like enemies in a radius, but after that, you can channel out this heavy attack, and that heavy attack fucks bosses, especially like captains with their shield down. You'd be very surprised. This weapon can hit like as hard as a thunder hammer when you hit in the head with that thing. So these weapons are just kind of a delight to play with. They're very cool aesthetically, and if a Psyker knows what they're doing with them, they can definitely top the charts. Check out like a Scryer's Gaze Psyker who's using this in a melee setting, and they'll definitely be very, very useful. So I rate them in the meta tier. Speaking of highly rated, but not quite that highly rated weapons, we've got our Crucis Thunderhammer. This is definitely a off-meta pick, right? It takes a lot of skill and talent to utilize one of these weapons properly. They are probably unrivaled in terms of like instant boss dunking power. You can instantly remove a captain with one of these things if you have all the blessings stacked up in just the right way. But the problem with them is like, what do you do with having this weapon between all of those fights? This is the one weapon in the game where I'm like, God, I wish I could bring a second melee weapon and just use that instead when I'm not doing that, because this weapon is really unwieldy to deal with when you're not dealing with a boss. Even when you're dealing with a boss, it is kind of jank to play around, but that's where it shines. Outside of that, it's kind of a pain to play around. And so I'm going to rate it off meta because you really, really need to know what you're doing. My friend Alexandria, she definitely knows what she's doing with it, and she gets like 500, 600,000 boss damage some games with the Thunderhammer Zealot, but I try it and I'm getting dumpstered and I'm getting like 200k. So yeah, it's definitely an off meta pick. You're going to need to have additional game knowledge to make that happen. We should talk about the Crusher at the same time. The Crusher is definitely meta. The Crusher is like kind of a variant on the Thunderhammer here. It exchanges a lot of the power in its weapon special for just general utility. The Crusher has really high stagger values. It has Skull Crusher. It has Thrust. Not Thrust. What did I mean to say? I meant to say Slaughterer. Slaughterer is it does have Thrust, but Slaughterer is probably your better one here, right? Similar blessings that the Thunderhammer does, but it ends up performing better on a baseline because its swing patterns are better and because its attack speed is better. This weapon scales crazy with attack speed. The more attack speed you have, the better it's gonna fare for you, and it's used both. I mean, it's only available on the Zealot and the Arbides. I would say that arguably the crown for which class uses it better probably goes very narrowly to the Arbides because he can guarantee stagger on bosses and stuff using just hitting heads, so he gets the full benefit out of that Skull Crusher blessing. But both weapons or both classes use it very, very well. The Zealot has his Fear of the Faithful charge, which has super rending. It rends 100% of armor on the crit that it delivers, so that can be very, very powerful because this weapon loves rending. It does need a little bit of boost when it comes to like these crusher targets. But outside of that, it's perfectly fine. Remember to use the push stab. The push stab is a very powerful attack on this weapon that can has an extra armor modifier. So yeah, it's a very, very solid weapon and definitely belongs in the meta tier. I was very pleased to see it on the Arbiter class. And let's do the other Thunderhammer while we're at it. The other Thunderhammer, I would say, is probably in the standard fare tier. The reasoning being, so this weapon's right to exist used to be that the weapon special, the activated Thunderhammer part of it, would ignore smaller enemies, and cleave through them, and then hit your primary target, right? It would only activate when it hit a elite. And that was awesome because at the time, the Crucis Thunderhammer had the same horizontal swing pattern on its charged heavies, and it was very hard to actually pick out the one target you wanted to hit. You would swing, and then some little piece of trash would get in the way, and it would eat your charge, and you'd be out a bunch of DPS, and that elite enemy would still be alive. But with the rework to these weapons, I think like 2 patches ago, the Crucis Thunderhammer was given an overhead strike down for its weapon special activated heavy attack, and that has solved that problem, because now you can just pick which target you want to drop the hammer on, and it's much more consistent in that way. You don't have to like jump and swing the weapon over the heads of all the little guys. So yeah, the reason for the Iron Helm existing has been kind of removed a little bit. It's still a fine weapon. I think it just needs to have a little something extra, because you bring a Thunderhammer for the boss damage and it sacrifices boss damage. Its activated weapon special damage is not nearly as high as the Crucis, so I just don't know why you'd bring it over anything else. We've got to put our Blaze swords up there, or Blaze Force swords, sorry. This is the Demos. This is definitely a meta weapon. These weapons, the Blaze swords, I think honestly, all of them are probably, like this is the Elise, that's fine. The Obscurus, the Obscurus is kind of wonky, but here, I'll put it down here. I don't think anyone really plays with the Obscurus, so I doubt anyone's going to be mad at me. But the two that people play with are the Demos and the Elise. The Demos is the king here, and the reason these weapons are good is because they have tons of good blessings on them. They have Uncanny Strike. They have Shred if you want to go for a more crit focused thing. They're just they have Slaughterer, right? They can scale, therefore, the damage that is on enemies that are soul blazed, and they can increase the soul blaze damage to enemies that have been hit by Uncanny Strike. So what you can do is you can get your soul blaze stacks up utilizing your staff, or even utilizing Venting Shriek, right? And then you can use this weapon to tap enemies in the head, which, I mean, I say tap, but the Demos hits enemies in the head like a fucking truck, and that'll stack up Uncanny, which means the Soul Blaze is going to do more damage. And of course, you can then stack up Slaughterer, which is going to mean the Soul Blaze is going to do more damage. So these are great synergistic weapons with the Psyker's kit, and it doesn't hurt that they do have access to some really solid strike down movesets for the Demos. This is like your single target deleter on Heavy 1, Heavy 2, and doesn't have a bad light swing pattern for dealing with hordes either. The Elise is sort of more your horde clear. You can still use it to remove heavy targets because the weapon special on both of these is the sort of like charge the blade and then lodge it into target and then blow them up after like a second. It kills a crusher in like 2 to 3 hits. But this thing has big sweeps on its Heavy 1, Heavy 2, so it's a more horde clear focus weapon. Both of them are very, very solid. They can definitely be used into Havoc, because for Psykers, the melee weapon really isn't all that important, and you get bonus points if your weapon in some way boosts the effectiveness of your general primary role, which is applying a bunch of dots to all the enemies and standing back while they all die. So I wouldn't probably choose these if I was going a melee focus Psyker. I would choose the Force Greatswords instead, but they're definitely really good in that melee slot on the Psyker, who's obviously the only person who has access to them. Speaking of weapons that used to only be accessible by the Psyker, I've got the 2 other dueling swords here. We already know the Macabian Mark IV dueling sword is overtuned, reasoning being that the Macabian Mark IV is just brain dead, right? It's just Heavy 1, Heavy 2, Heavy 1, Heavy 2, or even just Heavy 1, Weapon Special, Heavy 1, Weapon Special, rinse and repeat. That plus a really easy light swing pattern adds up to a weapon that's just kind of overtuned. It cleaves through, it just destroys armor way too easily because of Uncanny Strike and all the rending it provides, and of course thrust. So you charge this thing up to 60% extra power, and then you drop a fully uncanny thrust on a crusher's head, and he's 2/3 dead. You stagger him with the weapon special, and then you hit him again one time with a barely charged attack, and he is dead. So there's no counterplay to that. The Mark II, which is this one without the fancy handle, is pretty much the twin of that. I think I just put it in meta, honestly. They're both getting a nerf whenever this happens. It has the same, this is something that someone corrected me when we were doing the stream, but it has the same heavy one, the thrust. So you can just use the heavy one, and then you can weapon special, because it has the same weapon special too, the little reset jab that has a high stagger value. And you can just rinse and repeat that for the same effective, like, DPS. The problem being is that the second heavy attack is like an over your left shoulder sort of downwards sweep, and some people would argue this can be used for horde clear, but I don't really ever find myself needing horde clear in this weapon. You can just light attack if you really need to. So I think it's definitely still very, very strong. Honestly, if you just used the heavy attack one into weapon special, it would still be meta because of how strong it is at eliminating those like single heavy targets. But yeah, I'll just have to give it meta. Now, the best off meta, I'd say that this one falls into best off meta. This is our Mark V. The Mark V will also be receiving that nerf, but it'll be receiving a little bit of buffs at the same time, I imagine. This is based on the spurious leaked documents that released about these dueling swords. But this weapon has sort of overhead strike downs instead of those stabs, which automatically sets it way back because it's way harder to pick a target when you're striking down from the top of the screen than it is to just point your reticle directly where you want the attack to go, right? So that's a downside in its bucket, but it has access to the same blessings. And one thing that it does have is silly dodge distance. It's like 25% larger than any other weapon in the game. It's crazy. So, and if you're playing on like Psyker and you have 6 dodges, you can just dodge to the side and get a massive amount of distance. So it's a fun weapon, but it is still a little bit in that overtuned bracket. A lot of this, again, comes down to the sheer power of those heavy attacks on all of these marks, and of course the Uncanny Strike blessing just sort of putting its finger on the scale and removing the one balancing factor that a lot of these weapons have, which is, their damage against armor. So this weapon doesn't even care about armor. Then we've got the Relic Blade, guys. We've got the Mark II and the Mark X here. Mark II and Mark X are both meta weapons. So if you want to go a more horde clear focused, just be standing somewhere and just carving through everything that's coming at you through a funnel, it's the Mark X all the way. It's got, this is my preferred one. Maybe it's because I'm a noob and I just don't know how to use the Mark II as well. But you can just do light 1, light 2, heavy 3, heavy 4, rinse and repeat for just slashing through hordes, horizontal sweeps over and over and over again at head level. Then your heavy 1 is just an overhead strike down, and you've got the little push attack stab, so that comes out that has really good damage and rending against armor. So yeah, it's just an all-rounder solid weapon. I love both of these weapons. Oh, and your Mark II, by the way, I think it does like 2 horizontal slashes, and then you start doing uppercuts, and then over-the-top slashes, which have really high damage modifiers versus carapace and armor. You'd pretty much be instantly killing everything that isn't a crusher, and a crusher dies in 2 hits. So very, very strong there. It's going to have a higher boss damage potential than the Mark X does, but it's going to be a little bit less useful generally. But both of them are super strong. They've got great blessings. I love how the blessings on this and the Warp Greatsword are unique, right? They have fundamentally different sets of blessings they play with than any other weapons. So the right set isn't like immediately determined by, we'd have this weapon already. These weapons play very differently than other existing weapons, and they give me great hope for future weapons, especially like revamped power swords or something like that, because these activated abilities that they have on these things are really, really solid. And continuing from that trend, we've seen the release of the Arbides weapons this year, which also have very, very solid, if overpowered, weapon specials. I forgot to talk about that on the Arbides shock mod, by the way. This thing's weapon special, stupid. It hits an electrocuted enemy, and if it hits that electrocuted enemy, then they take a bunch of shocks over and over again. They're permanently staggered and then they die, basically. So if you hit any enemy that's lower than an Ogrin tier, lower than like a bulwark or something, they can't counterplay. they just get shocked a bunch of times and then they die, and it's just amazing for opening up shields. But yeah, so all these weapons that have been created since the Havoc update have been really, really nice. I think they're on fire with it, and the Relic Blade is no exception. We've got the Agni Shock Maul here. Honestly, I played a couple games with this after recording last night, and not bad. It definitely is in the meta tier. The secret with this thing is that you have a sweep on your heavy 1, right? So instead of having your heavy 1 be the overhead bonk, you first start with a sweep. So you can just go heavy 1, light 1, heavy 1, light 1, and that's your horde clear combo, just sweeping left and right, and it's perfectly effective. Or you can go light attack into heavies, and after that your heavy 2, heavy 3 will rinse and repeat, and you'll be just doing overheads, dropping overheads on enemies. So it's got a little bit more complicated setup than just the heavy 1 direct into heavy 1 from the Agni, but otherwise everything stays the same. It's just a variant on the weapon swing patterns, and you get that extra sweeping Vanguard strike on heavy 1 for this thing. But it's definitely still meta, right? It still benefits from the same weapon blessings and the shock prod effects on enemies. It's very useful on the arbitrator class especially. So yeah, don't sleep on either one of these shock mauls just because this bad boy exists. Try them out, and I promise you won't be disappointed. We got, speaking of disappointment, Reginald's favorite weapon, the Chain Axe. The Chain Axe, I think, I can't put any of these chain weapons any higher than the standard fair tier. The reason being, again, they were designed for a game that has passed them by. They require a lot of commitment to actually put that chain axe into the enemy and get the resulting damage. If you're not using the special, what's the purpose of using them, right? They do have a pretty good DPS output, but they're very clunky to play around. In some ways, they are the prototypical Darktide weapon. That they have some jank to them, but they have some power to be found in there somewhere. My problem with them is it just feels very stodgy. It feels very limiting to play with them, because a lot of your time is going to be spent like looking for an opening to actually sink the chain axe into an enemy and get that damage done. And I wish they were on the Arbides class, because I think the Arbides would have some excellent usage with them, since he can use his break the line ability to stagger enemies and then hit them with the weapon special while they're on the ground. And he could use Castigator stance to walk around while he was chain axing. I'm very sad that it didn't make it on that class, but perhaps there's a reason for that. But yeah, I have to put them in standard fare. I really hope that we see a pass on all of these chain weapons. All of them. Every chain weapon in the game should receive a pass with the upcoming balance changes they promised are coming, because that would make me very happy, since chain weapons are iconic of the 40k universe, and yeah, they'd be a welcome addition. I really long for a day where the Eviscerator, speaking of standard fare weapons, I long for a day where the Eviscerator is like back to being among the better weapons in the Zealot's arsenal. The Zealot, upon the release of the Relic Blade was everything the Eviscerator ever wanted to be. It's got way better horde clear. It honestly has better boss damage potential, and it's just a more well-rounded weapon. Your weapon special activation can block attacks, all that sort of stuff. This weapon, again, it suffers from that jank of needing to activate the chain, and that takes forever on these Eviscerators. They did a recent buff to them that was very small, but I just don't think it's bringing them into that meta or that Havoc viable bracket, because they lack the time to kill, and they leave you too vulnerable while you're doing what you're doing. I've played with them a good amount, because they're cool looking weapons. They feel cool, and Zealot used to be my main, and you just don't get any better results with them using them versus the Relic Blade. So I would love if they would receive a buff, because I think the fantasy for the Zealot being more focused around these big, sweeping, huge two-handed weapons, and then small, like, assassin weapons versus the dueling sword only would be amazing. But yeah, I'll give them standard fare for now. I don't think I'm offending anybody by putting them there, because no one outside of like Malice and Heresy is using these things. We got the Rashad, though, a weapon that is used in Malice and Heresy, but is crazy, crazy powerful. This thing dunks on bosses for like 5,000 plus damage on crits. It has both the finesse and first target stats on it, which is what makes it strike for so much. And it's just got a dumb sort of heavy strike moveset. You just do heavy one, heavy two, heavy one, heavy. It's just overhead chops over and over and over and over again, and those do add up. Those do start doing some real serious damage. Back in the day, this was one of the premier one-shotter weapons for the veteran. You know, you had no dueling sword to insta-dunk crushers, so this was your best alternate option, and it's still really good. This is on the Arbides, so if you're playing the Arbides right now, go check it out. Check out what sort of boss damage this thing can do. It is kind of absurd, and it's a very, very solid weapon, albeit very boring. I think that it and its brother, the Antax, both fall into that category of just being absurdly boring weapons that just, I mean, they were created in the version 1.0 of the game, right? They're clearly some of the first ideas that they had. But yeah, they're completely without flair or frills. But this one does have the stats to pay the bills. We've got our Mark III power sword here. Definitely too weak, right? These weapons took the big nerf. They took the big L way back in the day when the power cycler blessing was hit, as well as their general rending and damage potential when they were empowered. They now are mandatory to use the power cycler blessing, which takes one blessing away from you, and they just don't do anything. They don't do diddly shit outside of their activated mode. So this weapon has been hit harder than its brother, the Mark VI, because it just doesn't have the as good a swing pattern, and the Mark VI pretty much does everything you'd want this, you know, the power sword to actually do. But again, as I said before, the activatable ability is a drain on both of these weapons. The Mark VI gets a pass just because it has a good swing pattern to utilize those empowered swings, but you know, having that empowered ability make them only just barely cross that line of being Havoc viable is a sad state, because when these aren't empowered, you might as well just pull out your ranged weapon instead. They do nothing. So yeah, that's a complaint I've always had about Fat Shark's design around weapons that have activatable abilities, is they take too much power away from the baseline stats. So what I'd love to see is perhaps a Relic Blade revival of these sorts of weapons, where they have a longer empowered mode that is maybe less superpowered, or maybe they could just be always on, and then they have like rending and stuff like that while they're empowered, and a different move set, and when they're off they have a fundamentally different move set that is better for like light targets. Who knows? But yeah, that's sort of where I have to put in for now. Then we've got to talk about our heavy swords here. So we've got three options, and what happens when players look for heavy sword stuff, because heavy swords are alluring. What happens when players look for heavy sword stuff is they see a lot of players using the Mark 9, especially like in older YouTube content, because the Mark 9 has like really unga bunga, like upward, it's like over your right shoulder, diagonal down left, diagonal down right, just over and over. Just rinse and repeats. Makes a big X pattern on your screen. So it's really easy to use, right? But that is not as good as the other two options, because those heavy attacks do way less damage. And the special thing about this weapon is that its heavy attacks have like 25 cleave. Like, I can't remember if that got nerfed, but like they do some serious damage on those heavies, and you can put thrust and brutal momentum on this thing. And what we've got between the Mark 6 and Mark 7 over here is pretty much two flipped versions of themselves. I will put them into, oh man, it's tough. Just, you know what, just in the off chance that Fat Shark sees this, right, I'm going to put the Mark 9 down here in 2 week, because it doesn't have the damage of its competitors, and then I will put these two weapons at the top of standard fare. I think these weapons are king. If you're playing Auric and stuff, you will top the scoreboards. Especially, I think you have to play a Zealot. If you want to take these into Havoc, you have to play a Zealot with Fury of the Faithful. Because where they struggle is they have fucking zero rending. They cannot kill Crushers. They cannot kill metal to save your life. No joke, you'll be working on the single Crusher for like 15-20 seconds. It's absurd how long they take to do anything. But if you are blessed with a seed where it's all like like lighter targets, you can play them on any class, but you really do rely on these super rending on Zealot's Fury of the Faithful charge to get good damage onto Crushers outside of it. So if you're wondering what they do, I believe it's the Mark 6 that I like a little bit better. This is the Mark 6 here. God, they're like fucking identical. The Mark 6 has an overhead strike down that does a lot of damage. It's a single target. And then it sweeps sort of over your shoulder from the left and does like upward kind of, sorry, it would be under your shoulder from the left. Does sort of an upward sweep. And that thing can carve through like infinite number of heads. So usually what I do is I buffer the light attack and then I hold that secondary attack, charge into a group of enemies and carve them all in half, because it is a very, very strong attack and you could charge it up with thrust while you're on the way with Fury of the Faithful. So that's a really, really strong tactic. And I do have a heavy sword build somewhere on the channel. If you go through the channel and search for heavy sword, I think it says something about beheading in the title or something. Go check it out. It's pretty much remained unchanged since. And then the Mark 7 is just the inversion of that, where the heavy 1 is the sweep and the heavy 2 is the overhead. So yeah, choose your pick out of these. But I do think that they need some buffs. If these things had Uncanny Strike, it would make a world of difference. These would be in the best off meta tier, maybe even the meta tier if they had Uncanny Strike. But that remains to be seen if they get any changes for later days. So here we are, guys. This is the overall rankings. I don't think there's too much to be disagreed with in here. Remember that exceptional personal skill can move any weapon, especially those in the standard fare tier, up into the meta viable, the havoc viable tier. But I think that for general usage for players who are, maybe like sub 500 hours, you're probably going to want to stick to the weapons up here if you're really pushing your havoc rankings, and definitely stay away from anything way down here. These weapons are going to sabotage you if you invest time in them. But this is looking pretty good to me, honestly. Let me know if you have any crying opinions in the comments where you think I completely rated something wrong, but I did give it a good bit of testing and thought, and this is where I stand right now. So as you can see, Mr. E subbing is still in the 2-week tier. Make certain you're hitting that sub button, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.